The courtroom had never been so quiet, not in 30 years of criminal proceedings, not during the trial of the Busan drug cartel, not even when a sitting congressman had been walked in wearing handcuffs. But today, Seoul's most prestigious criminal court held its breath. Cameras caught everything: the packed gallery, the nervous prosecutors, the row of powerful men in expensive suits who had each, separately, assumed they were untouchable. Then the doors opened. She walked in alone. Vivian Johnson moved without hesitation, her dark glasses catching the morning light. Her posture so straight, you might have thought she was the one on trial. Except nobody who had done something wrong had ever walked like that. Her braids were pinned back neatly. Her blazer was pressed. Where her eyes should have met the room, there were only lenses that reflected the crowd back at itself. The courtroom murmured. A photographer's shutter clicked once, twice, relentlessly. She found the witness stand the way a person finds something they've rehearsed 100 times in the dark. By memory, by feel, by refusal to need what everyone assumed she needed. She raised her right hand. "Even blind," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room without effort, "I know exactly who ordered the attack." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in Seoul. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a door opened, and Kang Min-jae walked in smiling. Before the acid, before the darkness, before the whole world learned her name. Vivian Johnson had been fighting a different kind of battle, the quiet, grinding kind that doesn't make headlines. She was brilliant. Everyone in Seoul's journalism circles knew it, which was perhaps why they worked so hard to keep her underpaid and underutilized. A Nigerian-Korean investigative journalist in a city that still tilted its head slightly when it heard her speak flawless Korean. Not because the language was wrong, but because the face attached to it didn't match what certain editors had in mind when they pictured a journalist on the front page. She had spent 8 months digging into a pattern nobody wanted to acknowledge. Immigrant women, Nigerian, Vietnamese, Filipina, disappearing from the radar after taking jobs at luxury nightclubs in Gangnam. Police reports filed, police reports lost, families told to be patient, journalists who asked too many questions told, in various polite ways, to stop. Vivian kept asking. Every trail she pulled, every financial record she traced, every terrified witness she sat across from at 11 p.m. in a parking lot, they all eventually led to one name, a name people whispered differently than other names. A name that came with its own gravity. Kang Min-jae. He was 38. He owned 11 legitimate businesses and an unknowable number of illegitimate ones. Politicians took his calls, police commissioners attended his birthday dinners. He had been investigated 4 times and charged never. The newspapers called him a businessman. The streets called him something else. Vivian called him her next story. She had not expected to meet him at a charity gala for children's hospital funding. She had not expected him to be the best-dressed man in the room, or the calmest. She had not expected him to cross the room specifically toward her, with the kind of certainty that suggested he had known she would be there. She had not expected what he said. "You're investigating the wrong monster." He had smiled when he said it. Not a threatening smile. Something more unsettling. Like a man sharing information he found genuinely unfortunate. Vivian had looked at him, directly. "Then point me at the right one." He had walked away without answering, but he hadn't stopped watching her. In the weeks that followed, Vivian noticed things she couldn't entirely explain. Her apartment building quietly upgraded its entrance security. A man who had been following her to work. She had clocked him on Tuesday, tested him on Wednesday, vanished on Thursday. A witness who had refused her calls 3 times suddenly called her back, apologetic, saying he'd reconsidered. She was not naive. She confronted Min-jae at a restaurant she knew he frequented on Wednesday evenings, taking the seat across from him before his security could intervene. He looked at her the way he always did, like she was doing something impressive that he had already anticipated. "You've been protecting me," she said. "I've been watching the situation," he replied. "That's the same thing." He said nothing, but something shifted behind his eyes, almost imperceptibly. Most people in her experience talked to fill silence. Kang Min-jae used silence the way other men used words, deliberately, with specific intent. What he told her, eventually, over cold tea neither of them drank, changed the direction of her investigation entirely. The missing women operation wasn't his. He had known about it for 7 months. He had been trying to locate its origin, carefully, because its origin, he believed, sat inside the Korean government itself. A trafficking network not run by criminals pretending to be legitimate, run by legitimate men who had outsourced their depravity to criminal infrastructure. Vivian stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to find it anyway," he said simply. "I'd rather you found it correctly." She hated deeply that she believed him. The package arrived at her office on a Monday. Inside was a photograph of herself, burned at the edges, taken recently enough that she could see she was wearing the jacket she'd bought 3 weeks ago. Someone had written across it in red marker, "Stop digging or lose more than your career." That same night, riding home on her scooter, a motorcycle came at her from a side street at a speed that had nothing to do with traffic. She swerved. Not fast enough. Min Jae appeared. She would never be able to explain how he appeared, how he always managed to appear, and pulled her from the path of impact with a grip that left bruises on her arm for a week. What followed she would describe later as watching a different species of human being operate. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He moved through Seoul's back streets with cold, surgical purpose, and the motorcycle and the men on it ceased to be a problem before midnight. He brought her to his mansion. She told herself it was temporary. She stayed for 2 weeks. There were guards at every entrance, screens showing security feeds, the quiet hum of a place built around the expectation of danger. But there were also late-night conversations at a kitchen table that surprised her with its ordinariness. A man who read history books obsessively, who grew up, he told her once, in a house where power and love were never in the same room at the same time, and had spent his entire adult life accumulating one while assuming he'd forfeited the right to the other. "The men after you," he told her one night, voice quieter than she'd heard it. "They're not afraid of me anymore." "Should I be worried?" she asked. "Yes." He said it without drama. "Someone has entered this situation who believes they can operate above the consequences I represent. That is new." She sat with that. And then, because she was still a journalist and couldn't stop being one, even in the kitchen of Seoul's most feared criminal at 2 a.m. "Who?" He looked at her for a long time. "That's what we're both trying to find out. If the story is gripping you this deeply already, you'll want to stay until the very end." She found it in the data she'd extracted from a server linked to one of Gangnam's club networks, an encrypted audio file that took her 3 days to open and 45 minutes to listen to, sitting very still with headphones on. Voices she recognized. A police commissioner. A deputy minister of labor. 2 businessmen whose names appeared regularly in the financial press. All of them discussing, in the pragmatic tones of men scheduling a logistics meeting, the movement of immigrant women through networks they collectively owned. The recording also revealed a name she hadn't expected to find so close to her. One of Min Jae's most trusted lieutenants had been selling them information for 6 months. Every move she had made from his house, every document she had obtained, had been quietly reported. She was downloading the final copy of the evidence when the window of her office turned white. The explosion took the whole floor. They reported her dead. It suited everyone's purposes. She had escaped the explosion with the recording backed up to a device she kept on her body always, old journalist's habit, and had made it as far as an underground parking structure near Mapo Bridge before they caught her. There were 4 of them. They knew who she was. They knew what she carried. They gave her, she would later testify, a single opportunity to surrender the evidence. She told them, in Korean she'd been speaking since she was 6 years old, exactly what she thought of that offer. The acid hit her face before she could finish the sentence. She heard one of them say, as the darkness closed in, as her hands came up too late, as the sound of her own scream felt like something happening to a stranger. "Now let's see if the brave journalist still wants to testify." The last thing she saw was the parking structure's fluorescent ceiling flickering. Then nothing. She woke to voices. A doctor's voice. A nurse's voice. The words permanent and bilateral and irreversible, placed carefully into sentences, like people packing something fragile. She understood them. She lay for a long time in the dark that was now her permanent weather, and felt the full weight of what had been taken from her. The rage came first. Enormous, wordless, a thing with no edge she could push against. Then the humiliation of needing hands that weren't hers to stand, to navigate, to know if someone was in the room with her. Then the question that visited her at 3 a.m. and refused to leave. What is the point of any of this? Across Seoul, she would later learn, the city was waking up to strange news. A warehouse district in Incheon burned overnight. Gang captains who had attended meetings on Tuesday found missing by Thursday. Bodies in the Han River that the police for once were very eager to identify. Something was moving through Seoul's underworld like a fire with no visible origin, and the people who tracked such things were very afraid. Min-jae had stopped being careful. He was there when she woke on the 4th day. She knew because she heard his breathing. Already she was learning to hear differently, to file information the way a musician catalogs sound. "You blame yourself," she said. Not a question. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "If I'd moved faster," he began. "They were going to do this regardless," she said. "They needed to do this, because I had what they couldn't afford to let exist." A long silence, and then something she had not expected from a man who ran half of Seoul's criminal underworld, the sound of him breaking. Quietly, without display, without any performance of it, just the truth of a man who had run out of ways to hold something in. "You're the only person," she said softly, "who stayed. I should have done more." "You're here," she said. "That's more than everyone else." She reached out until she found his hand. He let her hold it. And they sat in the hospital room while Seoul moved outside the window, neither of them saying anything else for a very long time, both of them understanding that something had changed between them that neither of them had words for yet. The government assumed she was finished. They were, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong. Without her eyes, Vivian's hearing sharpened into something that frightened even her. She spent 3 months in intensive rehabilitation, and every hour she wasn't working on her body, she was working on her evidence. The recording she still had. But she had something additional now, something the men who had blinded her had accidentally given her. She had heard their voices. She had heard the voice of the man who gave the order. A voice she knew. A voice she had sat across from in interview settings. A voice she had heard on television during election campaigns. A voice she had heard in the audio recording with the police commissioner and the deputy minister. She also memorized, methodically and obsessively, every voice connected to the trafficking network. The conspiracy had a sound. She had catalogued it. The woman they tried to silence had become a human archive. Min-jae came to see her 3 weeks before the trial. He told her what exposing the conspiracy would cost him personally. 15 years of political alliances. Businesses through which he'd quietly funded 3 children's hospitals and 2 women's shelters. Leverage he would never rebuild. His own syndicate had turned on him. The word had spread that he was choosing a woman over the empire, and in that world, that was not a decision that went unanswered. He was, for the first time in 15 years, on the wrong end of the hunt. "You don't have to do this," Vivian told him. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." She understood that he wasn't doing it for her, exactly. He was doing it because she had made him remember, somewhere in the months of late-night kitchen conversations and shared silences, that he had once had convictions before he had power. That those 2 things had, at some point, parted ways. And that one of them was worth something, and one of them wasn't. She walked in alone. She named them one by one. A police commissioner she identified by his particular habit of clearing his throat before every sentence. A deputy minister whose speech pattern she had memorized from 47 hours of public recordings. A presidential candidate whose voice she had heard on the recording, unmistakable, discussing the trafficking routes with the comfort of a man who had never once imagined being caught. When she named the presidential candidate, the courtroom erupted. When she said she was prepared to identify the voice that gave the order for the acid attack, she heard it in this room, she said calmly. It was present in this building right now. the eruption became something else entirely. The assassination attempt came during the lunch recess. 2 gunmen dressed as courthouse security. Panic in the marble hallways. Min Jae, in the courtroom gallery, moved before anyone understood what was happening. Vivian heard the chaos around her and heard beneath it a voice giving instructions. Calm, directing the gunman. A voice she had heard twice before. Once on the recording, once in a hallway before the trial began. The voice of a man who had shaken her hand that morning and introduced himself as a senior court official. She said his name out loud in the middle of the gunfire. The building recorded it. The world heard it. He released the files publicly that night. Everything. Financial records, communications, surveillance logs, the names of every politician, police official, and businessman connected to the network. Information he had been accumulating for years, held as leverage, now released all at once in a single act that ended every alliance he had ever built and guaranteed his own arrest. The first indictments came within 48 hours. The presidential candidate's campaign collapsed before dawn. The police commissioner resigned by telephone. The deputy minister was taken into custody at an airport. Min Jae turned himself in at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday, wearing the same suit he'd worn to the charity gala where he'd first told Vivian she was investigating the wrong monster. He was for the first time not smiling. 1 year later, Vivian Johnson had been on the cover of 4 international magazines, spoken at the United Nations, and helped establish a legal fund for trafficking survivors that bore the names of 3 of the women she had spent 8 months trying to find. 2 of those women were still alive. She was still blind. She had stopped waiting for that to feel like a tragedy and started treating it as a fact, one of many facts that made up her life, none of them the whole story. She visited Min Jae on a Thursday afternoon, the same day she always visited when her schedule allowed. She knew the guard's footsteps by now. She knew the sound of the door, the particular acoustic of the visiting room, the weight of the air in the space between her chair and the glass. She heard him sit down. The sentencing is next month, he said. I know. A silence. Then, if you could see me again, would you still choose me? Vivian smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that starts somewhere behind the sternum and arrives at the face without asking permission. I saw you clearly, she said, long before I lost my eyes. She heard him exhale. She reached forward until her fingers found the glass, cold and solid, and entirely insufficient for what either of them wanted to say. On the other side of it, for the first time since she had known him, Kang Min Jae, the man who had terrified an entire city, who had dismantled his own empire and walked into a police station at 6 a.m. in a pressed suit, broke down and cried. She kept her hand on the glass until he was done. I'd leave you with these lessons that can be drawn from the beautiful story you've just listened to. 1. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more. Vivian Johnson was terrified. She lost her sight, her safety, and almost her will to continue. The attack was designed to silence her by taking from her the thing she relied on most. But courage was never about her eyes. It was about what she refused to let die inside her, even when she lay in darkness. The people who tried to silence her fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with, not because she was invincible, but because she had decided, clearly and early, that the truth mattered more than her comfort, her career, or even her safety. 2. Power without integrity is borrowed time. Every man in that courtroom, the politicians, the commissioners, the mafia networks, had spent years believing that power was its own protection. That being unreachable meant being unaccountable. Kang Min Jae understood, earlier than most, that this was an illusion. The moment he chose integrity over empire, he became more dangerous to the corrupt system than he had ever been as part of it. Real power, the story suggests, is not what you can take. It is what you are willing to give up for something true. 3. Being truly seen is the rarest and most transformative gift one human being can offer another. Vivian was dismissed, underpaid, and underestimated by every institution she worked within. Min Jae, in a room full of powerful people who saw only her race and her profession, saw something else: her fearlessness, her honesty, her willingness to speak to him without trembling. She, in turn, looked at a man the whole city had decided was a monster and saw the human being beneath the reputation. Their story is, at its heart, about what becomes possible when two people choose to see each other accurately. Not as they are convenient, not as they are threatening, but as they actually are. Some people lose their sight and lose their direction. Vivian Johnson lost her sight and found her purpose more clearly than ever before. The trial changed Korea. But long before the verdict, two people had already changed each other. In a hospital room, in a quiet kitchen, in the space between a glass partition and two hands that almost touched. That, perhaps, is the miracle the cameras missed.